We recommend Liberia strengthen the judicial system in order to ensure the respect for due process and reform the system of pre-trial detention.
The judiciary system needs to be better covered the entire country and to ensure access to justice and guarantee the right to a fair and timely trial.
To pursue judicial reform, especially to improve access to justice and to fight the inappropriate use of preventive detention.
Ireland remains concerned by prolonged pretrial detention as well as poor detention conditions in Liberia, and we strongly encourage Liberia to take further measures in this regard.
Japan recommends that Liberia's legal system be further enhanced to promote effective and smooth judicial procedure.
Take all necessary measures to improve court proceedings to guarantee the right of detainees to a fair trial within a reasonable time.
Spain recommends, therefore, that appropriate measures be taken to improve conditions for detainees, especially those awaiting trial.
Conditions by reducing pre-trial detentions, guarantee fair trial and ensuring access to health and sanitary facilities in order to protect the human rights of all persons in detentions. And 4, ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR aiming at the abolition of the death penalty.
1. Consider taking all necessary steps to introduce a de jure moratorium on capital executions with a view to fully abolish the death penalty and ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. 4. Adopt and ensure effective implementation of existing legislative proposals to improve conditions in prisons in line with international standards.
Spain recommends that 1. Malawi formalize a de jure moratorium and replace the death penalty with alternative sentences which respect international human rights standards. Similarly, we recommend an improvement in prison conditions, which would alleviate overcrowding and the conditions therein, and would guarantee a right to adequate food.
Australia recommends that Malawi move to abolish the death penalty, accede to the ICCPR's second optional protocol, and review the cases of those sentenced under the now abolished mandatory capital punishment for treason and murder, and provide appropriate resentencing decisions.
1. Develop and implement a comprehensive strategy and judicial reforms to effectively reduce the backlog of cases.
Step up efforts towards the abolition of the death penalty and the improvement of living conditions of the prison population.
Ireland recommends that the Government of Malawi submit the Prisons Bill of 2003 to Parliament for its consideration at the earliest opportunity and take meaningful action to deal with prison overcrowding, in particular through reducing the extraordinary periods of pre-trial detention faced by many detainees.
As such, Australia recommends the passage of the draft domestic violence legislation before Parliament to criminalise domestic violence, better protect victims and ensure perpetrators are prosecuted.
To remove barriers in accessing legal remedies against domestic violence, including by improving the collaboration between relevant institutions and revisiting evidentiary requirements, and to ensure that restraining orders are enforced.
Adopt the revised law against domestic violence, enhance awareness-raising campaigns about domestic violence, and expand services and protection for victims.
And finally, we recommend the government improve access of victims of domestic violence to effective protection and redress, strengthen the capacity for prosecution of perpetrators of domestic violence, and criminalize marital rape.
Positive work on revising the criminal code and other necessary legal framework, followed up by its effective implementation to ensure a legal framework and human rights culture that promotes equality and security for all. We also recommend that Mongolia strengthen its efforts to include women in decision-making processes and high-level positions.
To reinforce mechanisms to detect and investigate cases of domestic violence and train law enforcement officials to deal with such cases.
First, to strengthen the efforts to prevent gender-based and domestic violence by criminalizing marital rape and sexual harassment, providing victims with access to justice, assistance and protection, and by ensuring that cases are properly investigated and perpetrators duly prosecuted.
Turkey recommends Mongolia to adopt and actively pursue a focused national strategy on combating all forms of violence against women, which would promote awareness-raising activities related to the law to combat domestic violence.
Spain recommends that Bulgaria pursues policies for real gender equality and fighting domestic violence. We also recommend that Bulgaria collect statistical data on gender-based violence and try to understand why many cases are not reported.
Even though Bulgaria accepted numerous recommendations related to domestic violence during the first cycle, this is still not considered as a crime under the law in the criminal code. Switzerland would like to recommend to Bulgaria to take effective measures to ensure that domestic violence is prosecuted as a crime under the law and that the authors of such violence are brought to justice.
Brazil recommends that Bulgaria, 1, adopt the draft Gender Equality Act and criminalize domestic violence and marital rape.
Finally, the Czech Republic recommends that the government of Bulgaria improve prosecution and prevention of domestic violence and ensure that victims of domestic violence have access to shelters and other support services.
Estonia commends the adoption of the law on protection against domestic violence and the continuing work towards guaranteeing gender equality and women's rights, including sexual and reproductive health rights. We would like to urge Bulgaria, inter alia, to specifically criminalize domestic violence and marital rape and to introduce the possibility of ex officio prosecution for both offences.
We urge Bulgaria to amend its criminal code and criminal procedures code to specifically criminalize domestic violence and marital rape.
It recommends Bulgaria to modify the law on protection against domestic violence and to promote the prosecution of these crimes.
We recommend Bulgaria to consider amending the law so that it provides further efforts of redress for victims of domestic violence, in addition to increased punishment for repeated violations of violence against women.
They need to implement mechanisms that exclusively address this issue and that there is real specialisation. There needs to be legislative harmonisation, training, professionalisation of administrative staff, as well as creating judicial mechanisms. In this regard, Guatemala would respectfully recommend that Honduras consider widening its criminal legislation, not only criminalising cases of femicide, but all cases of violence against women. And also we recommend that you create specialised courts that exclusively deal with this problem.
Ireland recommends that Honduras take all necessary measures to ensure the effective implementation of the criminal code offence of gender-related killings of women and to guarantee effective access to justice for women who are victims of violence as well as their protection.
Italy recommends to guarantee protection and effective access to justice to women victims of violence, including by ensuring that perpetrators are brought to justice and by providing sufficient resources and targeted training to law enforcement, the judiciary and health service personnel.
More can be done to combat violence against women. We recommend that Honduras continues to strengthen legislative and policy measures to counter violence against women.
Spain recommends that exhaustive investigation be undertaken on gender-based murder of women. Also, the effective implementation of the Equality and Gender Equity Plan 2010-2022 by allocating technical and economic resources, and also reopening line 114, the hotline, the emergency hotline for women victims of gender violence.
4. Ensure adequate budget allocation to the prevention of sexual and gender-based violence. 5. Respond effectively to all forms of violence against women, including by providing law enforcement officials with gender training.
Second, that it investigate cases of the deaths of immigrants by workers in customs and border patrols, particularly those where there are indications of the excessive use of force, to ensure accountability in these cases and appropriate reparation to the family members of the victim. That it guarantee respect for the family unit of migrants in prison and the continued expanding efforts to protect the human rights of migrant persons, particularly their economic and social and cultural rights.
Consider ratifying the International Convention on Migrants' Rights and Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families and ILO Convention 189.
Facilitating access for undocumented immigrants and their children to health care under that act. That special attention is given to protecting migrant workers from exploitative working conditions, specifically in the agricultural sector.
Sweden recommends the US to introduce a national moratorium on the death penalty, aiming at a complete abolition, and to take all necessary measures to ensure that the death penalty complies with minimum standards under international law. Persons with mental illness should be exempted from execution. The US should commit to ensure that the origin of drugs being used is made public. To halt the detention of immigrant families and children, seek alternatives to detention and end use of detention for reason of deterrence.
We are, however, concerned about reports of racial profiling by local law enforcement and immigration authorities that encourage stronger efforts to ensure that the rights of immigrants are duly protected.
It avoids the criminalization of migrants. Uruguay recommends that a moratorium be placed on the death penalty with a view to its abolition once and for all in all states.
Consider alternatives to the detention of migrants, particularly children. And 3, implement measures to assist states and local governments in combating excessive use of force by the police and eliminating racial profiling.
That at the federal level, a moratorium be placed on executions leading to the final abolition of the death penalty, identify factors of racial disparity in the application of the death penalty, and draw up strategies to put an end to possible discriminatory practices, to guarantee that no person suffering from a mental disability is executed, commit to full transparency on the mixtures of drugs used in executions by injection. Honduras would like to make the following recommendations to the United States: that it ratify the International Convention for the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and their family members.
Addresses the legislative gap that relates to domestic violence offenses and updates the criminal code to recognize domestic violence as a criminal offense.
Strengthen its efforts to properly respond to allegations of domestic violence, including by training police officers, prosecutors and judges, and to ensure that women victims of violence obtain adequate redress and support.
Bulgaria recommends Croatia to implement the Human Rights Committee March 2015 recommendations on gender-based violence.
Canada recommends that Croatia, 1, improve services and support for women victims of domestic violence by conducting effective investigations, vigorously prosecuting the perpetrators, ending the practice of prosecuting victims, and ensuring victims have access to protection and shelters.
We recommend Croatia to review compliance of the criminal code, which now defines domestic violence only as a bodily injury, with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
In order to improve the protection of women's rights, Italy recommends to enhance efforts to fight all forms of discrimination against women and gender-based violence.
That efforts aimed at the implementation of legal provisions against domestic violence and gender violence be redoubled, paying particular attention to awareness raising and proper training of the police.
We have 2 recommendations. First, to ensure all human rights violations, including assassinations of journalists and human rights defenders, are investigated and the perpetrators brought to justice.
Conduct impartial, thorough and effective investigations into all cases of attacks, harassment and intimidation of human rights defenders and journalists, and hold all perpetrators accountable. 3, adopt clear and enforceable provisions criminalizing violence against women, including domestic and sexual violence.
Denmark recommends that Libya takes judicial and administrative measures to ensure equality and empowerment of women, including fair representation in the legislative and executive branches of the state and participation in political decision-making.
The Netherlands has 2 recommendations. First, the Netherlands recommends Libya to ensure the safety of all vulnerable groups, including women, journalists and human rights defenders.
We recommend that the government of Libya addresses discrimination against women so that women can transfer their nationality to their children and foreign spouses.
2, to take action to stop attacks on human rights defenders and make sure that perpetrators are held accountable for crimes committed in accordance with international standards.